Finding the right candidate for church staff can be difficult. We're going to employ some tactics for you today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, man, we are talking about hiring good church staff. This has come up a lot. I think that there's been a lot of turnover in a lot of churches all around, certainly in the United States. Maybe this is happening other places too around the world. And churches, it's hard sometimes to find the right person for their position. So we want to give some advice today. Three main sort of sections of this. One, in the how to find a good candidate. Two, what should you look for in a candidate? And three, what should you do in the interview process to make sure you're getting a good candidate? So it's kind of broken up in those three key phases today.
Yeah, let's just jump right in. So, trying to find a good candidate. Well, I guess it depends on the position that you're hiring for, what level that position is at, whether you want to keep it internal or external. But there also, though, are a lot of resumes that go around for quite a while. Not everybody is a good candidate, no matter how good they think they are, Scott. So sometimes we've got to be able to break out of maybe resumes that have been floating for quite a while. I don't know if maybe you think there's some people that are just always they're continuing to work somewhere, but they're just always like, hey, if something better comes along, I'll take it. And so they're just always out there in the open market.
Well, what I tend to see happen is you have this happens especially when you're talking about a denominational set of churches in a particular region. So you have, let's say all the Baptist churches in one particular area of the country, they're all kind of competing for the same handful of candidates. Mm-hmm. And so within a span of time, so like over a six or 12-month period, there are only so many people who are actively searching for a position. And they're the same, all of the churches are then competing for that same handful of candidates. Some of those are better than others. The ones that are pretty good candidates get swooped up pretty quick. So now you kind of have these handful of candidates that just end up getting interviewed by all the different churches, and they're not really all that great of a candidate. And some churches end up then just settling and going, well, I guess this guy was not great, but what else are we going to do? We're not getting any resumes in. We're just getting these handful in. And so it's just like a recycled pool of resumes. So you really want to break free from that by making sure you're tapping into other sources of potential candidates. So a few tips on this. The first one that should be mentioned is internal candidates. Make sure that, and you should start here. This should be your first place to look. Do we have a good candidate internally? This could be an existing staff person who you could maybe elevate to a new position, or if it's a lower level position, maybe there's someone in the congregation that you could hire. If you've gone through the leadership pipeline design process with us, we would say target your level 3 leaders. These are people who are managers, coaches, team captain type folks. Those are good potential candidates for a hire. These people already know your culture. They know how your church works. They have existing relationships. They have some degree of, sway or influence with people. And you already have a sense of their character, both the strengths and weaknesses. You know where they need to grow and develop. You already know what's good. So there's a real leg up when you have a known quantity. So the first thing you really ought to do is look internally. Is there a good internal candidate? Now, sometimes churches just hire internally because it's easier without asking any of the other questions we're going to talk about. later in the podcast. So don't just assume, well, this is easier, so let's just make this higher. Sometimes you need to break out of that internal pool. So a couple other places to find some good opportunities. One would be to work with an outside church search staffing firm. Look for we've worked with the shepherd staff several times. They're our kind of recommended partner. We don't get anything from recommending them. We just really like them, and they do a really great job. The churches that we have worked with them have had a really positive experience, so we highly recommend the shepherd staff. But they have a network of passive searchers, AJ, people who are open to a new position but are actively searching. So those are folks that are potentially good candidate. And another maybe less thought about option, AJ, is to contact people within your sphere of influence or connection. So maybe a larger church that maybe has a good associate who's maybe interested in becoming a senior pastor or taking on a different position. Work your network of folks, and that way you can find some people who are passive job seekers, people who are not actively looking for a new job, but who are open to a new position.
Yeah. So also, I'm going to plug from a few weeks ago, episode 156, we talked about fair pastor compensation. If your church is more in a position where the best candidates are not choosing you and going somewhere else, then there's a bit of a relationship here between the quality of the church that's hiring and the quality of the candidate as well.
Yeah.
So if you're missing out on some good candidates, it may not be that you're searching wrong. It might be you. So check that out as well. But all right, so let's
Joel, I will just say this. I want to, before we move on real fast, just as a quick case study, a church that I've worked with, I've actually mentioned the same church not too long ago on the podcast. But they had a position opening, and they were just going to do an internal search. And I said, hey, just check with shepherd staff. They ended up working with them. They were blown away. They were like, we don't ever get this many good candidates. I mean, it's not that they weren't getting resumes before, but in terms of getting just the volume of quality candidates, they actually had choices, to sort through. And the information that they got, these folks were already vetted. So by the time it comes to their search team, they haven't had to weed through all of the folks that aren't qualified or aren't good fits. They're only seeing the candidate profiles of people who are all probably going to be pretty good candidates. So there's just real value in that. And so they took what probably could have been a very long search process with not very many good candidates, and it ended up being they got several really good candidates, hired someone really quickly who's actually starting in a month. So again, I'm not trying to sell you something here, but I have been so impressed by those kinds of results for churches. Just consider it as an option. Don't write it off immediately and go, we can't afford that, or that's outside our wheelhouse. At least consider it.
Okay, so let's get into looking at the qualities of a good hire. So we're outside of the resume process, the search process. We have some candidates. We're going to start evaluating people. First and foremost, godliness and integrity. Hopefully this would be at the top of your list as well. Not that we have ranked all of the things we're going to talk about, but this one deserves to be on the top of the heap for sure. And whenever we look at, elders, overseers, pastors, we go into like 1 Timothy, Titus, we have these qualifications. I don't know, if you've ever really paid much attention to those qualifications, it's not a high bar, Scott. I don't think we're asking too much in 1 Timothy and Titus. We're like, whoa, look at this.
Yeah.
Good character.
Right.
I think that's reasonable to expect from everybody. And so that to me is just the beginning. Also, in Acts, what's the chapter in Acts where the kind of the first deacons are called, the waiting
Acts
tables?
6.
6. Yeah, 6. Again, they put forth a couple of very basic qualities that these individuals should display. This is bare minimum for any staff position in the church. We should be looking for this level of character. And you mentioned in the show notes, Scott, fruits of the Spirit, obviously. We want this doesn't really require a whole lot of discussion, I don't think. It's pretty clear who we should be looking for, don't you think?
Yeah. So when it comes to hiring staff, I think that the mistake that churches make in finding a good hire or looking for a good hire is they get really hyper focused on finding someone who's a good individual contributor. Like they have a very particular set of skills, right? Like they're really a really good musician, or they're a really good preacher, or they're really good at this. And I'm not saying those things are not important, but what I'm trying to emphasize here in the show notes, AJ, is the importance of finding people who have the right character and capacity for leadership. And that should be the foundation. And then their real skill and ability is sort of the icing on the cake. And we often get those disproportionate. So what we've done here in the show notes is create a list of, it's not comprehensive by any means, but just a basic list of character qualities and capacity, leadership capacity things, competencies that I think you should look for. So you mentioned the first one's godliness and integrity. That's fundamental and should be assumed. But again, sometimes we get distracted by the shiny thing and go, they're really good musician, they're really good preacher, they're really good this. And we don't ask the question, what's their character like? Is this person of godliness and integrity? And so it's possible to hire someone who actually doesn't have good character, because we can get distracted. The moving through the list then, AJ, and we don't need to spend too much time on each of these. People can go to the show notes, which will be at malfirstgroup.com/159 to get a deeper description of each of these. But next on that list, AJ, is going to be strategic planning ability. And connected to that, the next one is self-starter and problem solver. This idea of, I can see challenges, I can see something on the horizon, and I'm playing 4D chess a little bit and forecasting problems and being able to solve them. That's really important. When you're hiring someone to be on your staff, they need to be good at that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Moving on. Do they have any kind of track record for growth? That doesn't need to be that, they took a church of 100 up to 600, they're like this top of the heap leader. Have they just done well? Have they found success leading ministry areas in the church, whatever capacity they were in? Did they do well? Did they excel in that area? Doesn't really need to be overly complicated.
I have a bias here, so I'm just gonna be real honest. I have seen churches struggle at things, and then they need to hire a new pastor, and then they hire someone who's leaving a situation that was also bad. And it's really easy, I think, as a leader to think, well, this thing didn't grow, or this thing wasn't successful, but it wasn't my fault. It was that crummy old board that I had, or the people just didn't respond to my leadership. And to me, those are red flags, because I'm going, well, why was the board crummy? Why weren't people responding to your leadership? I'm not saying that there aren't ever externalities that are not your fault for why things don't work, but a good self-aware leader should be able to say, here's what I own. Here's why I think this thing didn't work out. Given another opportunity to do it, here's what I would do differently. And if you don't have that kind of self-awareness about why something didn't work, that to me is a problem. And I do want to show me something that you've led that's grown. If everything you've pointed to, it was plateaued or declining at the end of your tenure, I don't want to hire you. Like, that's not someone I want on my team. Because leaders lead, and healthy leaders help things grow. And that's not always necessarily numerical or explosive or any of that. I'm not suggesting that, but if you can't influence people in a positive direction, you're not leading. And I only hire leaders. That's kind of for me, only hire leaders. And you need to be able to point to something concrete that you've done that was successful. It doesn't mean everything you did had to be successful, but you need to show me that you have the ability to lead something successfully. And the things that didn't work out, I want you to have the self-awareness to tell me why it didn't, or what you would do differently. And if you're just blaming other people or external factors, that to me is a problem.
Yeah.
So,
our next one is good communication skills amongst individuals and across the congregation, across the staff team, really at all levels. I mean, in whatever position they're in, they've got to be able to communicate effectively to those that are working underneath them and around them. Obviously that's more important the higher up the food chain you go. But you've got to, you have to deal with tough things as well. So, I mean, anybody can, or not anybody, but a lot of people can present information in a clear way, but how well do they respond in relationships or in conflict and times of distrust or miscommunication. So these are all areas that a good hire is going to be able to excel in, is dealing with issues in the church in a way that provides good information, good responsibility for whatever they played in whatever situation was. All these aspects of just making sure that good information is communicated well.
yeah, it's right. It's management. Like most ministry is just people work, and so you need to understand how people work in order to do people work. And you need to be able to engage with people without being manipulative. I mean, you need to be able to manage your own emotions and the emotions of a group without manipulating the emotions of the group. And just point to Jesus and how he was masterful at shaping the emotions of a crowd or of a group of people without in any way manipulating them into feeling a certain way. And so a good leader has control over his or her own emotions and has the ability to shape the emotion of a room as well. Connected to that, I think, is this next point, AJ, in being teachable. You need to be able to hear hard things, and you need to be willing to learn. And for someone to say, hey, this didn't go so well, and here's something that I think you should do differently or whatever. And sometimes the source of that information can be someone that you maybe don't have loads of respect for or whatever. And you need to be able to divorce yourself from that and assess what they're saying. Is this true? Is this right? Is this good? How do I need to respond to that? And being open to feedback, open to new information, pursuing information from outside sources, from books and podcasts and things like that, always wanting to be learning. I know for me, I don't always like hearing hard things, but I do like learning new things. And so for me, I have to work on the feedback part. But I certainly have a curious person. So hire curious people, hire people who always want to be learning.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. You can't really divorce humility from teachability. And this kind of brings us back to the top, about just biblical character. So if they have humility about them, they likely will be teachable as well.
That's right.
All right, this next one kind of also goes back to where you were kind of introing this, Scott, and that's looking at these areas of specialization. Not that they're not needed, and there are some areas in the church in which we need hyper specialization. Like if we're going to hire a vocalist or a musician, they can't be generalists in, well, I'm good at leading people, but I don't sing that well. Like, well, okay, we need a little more specialization than that. So when it's time for specialization, we can look for that expertise. But when it's not necessary, then we should put character above that.
Yeah, well, and I've talked about this on the podcast before. We'll talk about it again. This is for me, like one of the things I really hang my hat on when I talk about staffing. I will take a B- in the specialization area who is in that person if they're an A+ leader. versus someone who is A+ in their specialization and a B- or a C leader. Because someone who is an A+ leader will surround themselves with better talent. Someone who is an A+ in the talent section but not a very good leader, sometimes they become insecure and it has to be all about them and their talent, and so they actually suppress the talent of people around them so that they themselves can look better. And so I don't like that. So I'm willing to take somebody, even when we're talking about music, they don't have to be amazing, they have to be passably competent. And that to me is the bar for success. If they're passably competent, that's okay, so long as they're an A+ leader. Now, if you're hiring someone who they're not a very good leader and they're not very talented, well, don't do that. But and obviously, if you can find someone who's super talented and a super leader, that's even better. But since we deal in reality, if you have to make a compromise somewhere, compromise on their personal talent, not on the leadership skill, because someone who is a good leader will be able to compensate for any deficiency that they might have. And I would again just kind of use myself as a test case for this. I'm not saying I'm an A+ leader or any of that, but I am saying my leadership skills were always a little bit better than my worship leading skills. And so when I had to lead that kind of ministry for a number of years before I was able to pass it off to someone else, I am passable at that. I can carry a tune and I can play the necessary chords on a guitar and carry the rhythm and all of that. But I was always better at leading than I was at playing music. And I think that was okay because I really did surround myself with people who were much, much better than me, which made it all the easier to pass that ministry off, a couple years down the road and not feel bad about it. I was happy to do it, and I had plenty of people who were qualified to do it. So hire for leadership first and for talent second.
Yeah. Good rule of thumb. All right. So we kind of talked about the evaluation of potential candidates in a pool and the character that we'd be looking for in candidates. Talk a little bit about weeding out bad candidates. So getting more into, the interview process and assessment process. So first of all, selecting the right references and asking good questions. And so this is definitely an area, especially Scott, with kind of some of the suggestions that you've noted in here, would take a hiring committee or whatever small group of people is going to be hiring into a little bit more work.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is something that typically, whoever you're interviewing, they're going to give you references, and they're going to give you references that they know are going to give them a good reference. So this often just becomes a rubber stamp type situation, right? What you want to do is do a little bit more work, like you said, dig a little bit deeper, find out who was their previous supervisor. If they didn't put that person down, you might go, make a note of that, track that person down and talk to them. Now, again, things can end poorly. We know that, and you can take that with a grain of salt, but find out why, find out what happened. And see, is there something more there that you need to know about? It's not immediately disqualifying if they had a bad relationship with a particular person on the team. It's not, but you should know what was that, and is there an issue behind that you would want to know about? How to find someone that they led, not just someone that led them or was a peer with them, but find someone who served on a team that they led, or if they oversaw staff, someone that reported to them, so that you can find out what kind of leader they are. What is it like to be led by this person? Those folks don't normally make it onto the reference sheet, but you should find someone like that and talk to them.
Yeah. And so many times in the hiring process, checking references is like the last thing. Like, okay, we're about to make a decision. Like, we got to call the references. If you did that earlier in the process, depending on what you get, you might have some other things then to talk about with the candidate, learn a little bit more about them, hear their side of a story as well. If I'm not saying on somebody that they put down, because it probably is going to be good, but if you track somebody down, there's a little bit of a story. You're like, I'm not sure maybe what the whole story is. Gives you something to talk about in the interview process as well. So maybe
Yeah.
consider reference checking not being the 5 minutes before you offer them the job, of just making sure that they actually gave you decent phone numbers. Go a little bit deeper with that.
Yeah, and this will be tied to the second thing that we have under this section of maximizing the interview process. But when you do talk to references, ask questions connected to those competencies that we talked about in the last section. So don't just go, well, what's he like? What's it like working for this person? No, ask questions like, tell me about a time that he had to solve a problem. Or if you're talking to their supervisor, was it really hard to get her motivated, or was she pretty? Did she show a lot of initiative in her work? So ask questions related to the competencies that you define as necessary for a good staff person. Don't just ask very generic questions. Ask questions related to the competencies so that you can double check that what they say is true of themselves is actually true in the way that they manifest their leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a great list. Taking a little bit more time to plan out your hiring process with more of in a checklist format, even as we've kind of outlined some of these things, is going to help maximize this really lengthy and expensive endeavor that you're in. I mean, it's one thing if you're like, okay, yeah, we've got like a super low level position. We just need to get somebody that has this skill and get it done. But if you're talking about leading ministries in the church, there's a lot at stake. And so we definitely would encourage you to really consider all this and go in with a plan of action on how you're going to find the best candidate.
Yeah, assume that. I mean, right now the tenure for most staff positions is under 2 years, even when you're talking senior pastor positions. And so you might be thinking, well, this is a lot of work for someone who may not stick around very long. Well, maybe they didn't stick around very long because we didn't put the we didn't take the time to find the right person. So you should make an assumption when you're making a hire here. This person could be here for a decade. Or maybe a better way to think of it is, let's be sure we hire someone that we would be glad to have around for a decade. It would be a joy to have them around for a decade. So put in the work. Churches tend not to fire people unless, they have a moral failure. So, but they ought to. Well, that's a different episode. They should fire for incompetence, but they don't. So since that's the reality, be sure you're hiring someone who is highly competent, because it's very difficult to ask church staff to leave for reasons other than, moral failure. So be sure you're hiring a good person who will be a joy to have around for a decade and will bring health to your church.
Well, there you have it. And today's notes again are over at malforsgroup.com/159. The YouTube video version of this is also linked there. If you go over to that page, maybe send this over to your HR person or search committee, and maybe just give them a couple of new angles, maybe to consider whatever the next hire is that's happening at your church. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again next week.